The inevitable crash, which I think we all thought was going to happen at some point this season between the two McLaren drivers, has finally happened at the Canadian Grand Prix, and Lando took full responsibility immediately after the crash. And in a way, because he did that and because he was 100% at fault, it was kind of a really tame crash between two teammates, and almost the tamest crash I have ever seen between teammates, to be honest. In terms of the crash itself, there's not really too much to say, to be honest. After battling at the end of that lap, Oscar actually pulled off a very good move, being very late onto the brakes going into the final corner, maintaining the race lead, going onto the main straight. Now, straight away with Lando behind him, Oscar was already moving over to the left-hand side pretty early because he was always going to defend the inside line into turn 1. There's no way that he was going to open that up for Lando to just dive it down the inside. And for some reason, I think Lando just got a little bit of tunnel vision. He just kept following Oscar's slipstream for some reason, and clearly that gap was always going to close. And I think he just misjudged how long his car was and how close he was to Oscar Piastri, crashing into the back of him. Now, the consequences I think were actually pretty serious because it seemed like a pretty light hit, even though it was clearly very heavy, but Lando immediately lost his front wing, he was crashed into the side of the barrier, and he was out of the race. I think it's worth noting that this could have been a lot worse for McLaren. In the end, Oscar went on to finish P4 just outside of the podium after getting jumped by Antonelli at the start, and in terms of the championship standings, it was a definitely bad weekend for McLaren. It was their first race this season without a podium. However, when it comes for Oscar, in a strange way, even though it was definitely one of his weakest weekends of the championship so far, it was kind of a race of damage limitations in the end compared to his championship rivals. Max Verstappen didn't win the race, he finished second. Obviously his teammate was out of the points and out of the race, and so Oscar did extend his lead to Lando Norris from 10 points to 22 points now, going into the middle portion of the season. However, behind McLaren in the Constructors' Championship, Mercedes jumped Ferrari to go second behind McLaren. However, they are still 175 points behind McLaren in first place. And now, the irony of this crash for me is that, of course, my previous video was all about this kind of Lando and Oscar relationship, whether or not we're going to see some toxicity or some crashes very soon. Because, as I said in that video, and again, the irony of me posting that literally before the Canadian Grand Prix is that Zach Brown and Andrea Stella are very realistic. They instilled a team-first philosophy and a team-first mentality into Oscar and Lando's heads. And as Zach himself mentioned, to kind of almost preempt the crash happening at some point during the season, it was only a matter of time given that McLaren definitely allows their drivers to race with no team orders before we saw a Piastri and Norris collision. Now again, because of that preempting kind of mentality that Zach had, and because Norris also took full responsibility, it kind of diffused the situation from what maybe could have been a controversial crash. I think the crash also took attention completely away from the more important story, which is McLaren's performance. Mercedes and Red Bull definitely looked more competitive this weekend, especially the Mercedes, given that Antonelli also qualified in the top 4 and then ended up finishing on the podium. And to be honest, when it comes to the kind of wider discussion about McLaren, I just don't really think that, as controversial as some people might want to make this crash be, I just don't really think it has that big of an impact on either McLaren or Oscar Piastri. However, the bigger story from the crash is definitely Lando Norris. And now this crash was just emblematic of something that has continued into 2025 from 2024, which is that Lando Norris, and let's get this clear, is a talented racing driver. He is fast in that McLaren, and he has got the pace to challenge for pole positions and also race wins and also the championship. But he has consistently, since last year, struggled to execute under pressure. Not for the first time, he made yet another mistake in Q3, which then put him under more pressure because that last run was even more critical. And in the end, under pressure, he just wasn't comfortable to get the most out of the car and ended up qualifying in 7th. Now, under-delivering in qualifying meant that he was already on the back foot going into the race. We already know how difficult it is to overtake other cars, especially at the front of the grid. And when it comes to that crash with Piastri, I think it was just born out of desperation, frustration, and it was, like I said, just a moment of head loss in a way, because misjudging his slipstream and just driving into the back of his teammates, to me that is just a moment of total head loss and total concentration. And it's just so strange because after a perfect Australia where he was undoubtedly the driver of the race, this has just gone down and downhill as the pressure from the likes of Verstappen and Piastri has continued to rise. And now, last season, I was very critical of Lando, as I'm sure many of you will know. There was a couple of videos in particular that a lot of his fans were not very big fans of, and there was definitely a lot of pushback from the Lando fan base. Some people even thought that I was a Lando hater, which, you know, everyone is allowed their opinion just as I am allowed mine. However, I think that I was being fair because the reason why I was so critical and so harsh and, in many people's eyes, even overly aggressive and overly critical about Lando is that I had very high expectations of him when he was finally going to be given a championship level car. This is a driver who, since 2021, I have put in my top 5 drivers of the season every single year since 2021. So that should tell you, even before last year, just how highly I rated Lando. And he was a disappointment in my opinion when he was given a car that was able to challenge for a title. He wasn't able, after Miami, to close the gap to Max Verstappen between Miami and Las Vegas. And again, I felt he under-delivered. I felt he made far too many mistakes, especially in qualifying and especially at the beginning of races and race starts. And he just did not look like a championship caliber driver, despite the fact that he did a lot of talking in the past about how much easier it was for the likes of Lewis and also Max to win races in dominant cars. And I think he definitely got humbled in 2024, which is why I felt that my criticism was more than fair. Going into the season, there was very key areas where Lando needed to improve on, and number one was his race starts, because once again he was always very quick in qualifying. He was able to qualify on the front row and beat and even dominate Oscar Piastri last year, but he is definitely, I think, being caught out by how much Oscar has improved from year 2 into year 3. Lando always has thrived when the entire team is around him, especially Zach Brown, who loves talking Lando up, and rightly so. You know, he is his driver, maybe sometimes a little bit too much with the quote that we are entering the Lando Norris era of the likes of Hamilton, Senna and Schumacher, but he just thrived off that kind of mental stimulation from his team principal, and everyone loves being loved inside of the team. But I do think that with the arrival of Oscar Piastri and how much hype Oscar created, winning a sprint race as a rookie, winning a Grand Prix in his second season, and now potentially, you know, being the favorite and maybe even winning the title in his third, I think it definitely has unsettled Lando a little bit. And I do not think that we're seeing the same confident Lando that we saw when he was up against Daniel Ricciardo, for example. I think what's worrying is that it looks like Lando Norris is starting to plateau as a driver when it comes to his development. He was so good as a young driver, as a rookie, kind of making that next step to then being a very good driver in the midfield, scoring his first podium, and then also becoming a top driver, a top 5 driver in my opinion, year after 2021. But ever since he's got into a championship challenging car, and that includes the beginning of this season, it just feels like his development has plateaued compared to the likes of Piastri, and where it currently is not enough to win the World Championship. He is clearly not operating at the top of his game. I think mentally is where he really needs some help, and whether that's from outside sources and outside people like maybe a Sebastian Vettel or a Nico Rosberg, someone who is not his family or his friends or his girlfriend, someone who is outside of his social circle. I think that could really help him, because Lando is an emotional driver, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some drivers are just a little bit more, they drive a little bit more of their emotions, and it does seem like Lando is one of those drivers. He is also someone who is very critical and very honest, and that is a credit to him. He was always the first one to say whether something is his fault or whether he underdelivered even when he had a better car. And sometimes I do feel like maybe he's a little bit too hard on himself, and I really do think that he would gain a lot from having an experienced voice who has been in Formula 1 before, maybe even an ex-world champion, in his corner, just reassuring him when things are not going his way. And now I think it's worth mentioning that Lando is not exactly 100% comfortable in the MCL 39 this season. He was very honest at the beginning of the season with the fact that the car just isn't quite driving and isn't quite responding to what he really would like in a car. But the team has tried, as we saw over Canada actually, bringing suspension upgrades onto the car to get it into a better window for Lando without taking away too much of that raw performance that has made it so great during the first third of the season. However, clearly it is not working because he continued to make mistakes. You saw his engineer Will Joseph also teaching and coaching him a little bit when it comes to the braking zone, so you can tell that Lando is not comfortable within his situation at the moment. He is not comfortable with this car, but there's not really too much that he can do because on the other side of the garage, Oscar Piastri for the most part has been performing. And so this is where I think the heart of the issue really lies. When he was up against Daniel Ricciardo, for example, who was himself struggling with the car, there wasn't someone like a Piastri outperforming him and kind of superseding his opinion and his authority at the team. The Oscar Piastri side to all of this I think is absolutely key, as much as some people might think that I am just using it as a stick to beat Lando, but in truth they are totally interlinked. If Piastri wasn't there at the team performing at the level that he is, I don't think Lando would be doing as bad as he is right now, because when it comes to Oscar, he has come into Formula 1 and very quickly he looked like a driver who had been in this sport for 5, maybe even 10 years off the back of some of his performances. Lando just does not look as complete as a driver, despite the fact that he is in his 7th season of Formula 1 as Oscar Piastri. And all of those things that Oscar does better than Lando, it reflects even worse on Lando, and that is what puts even more pressure on him. That is not even talking about the Max Verstappen element to all of this, because when you have the likes of Verstappen and Piastri in a title fight, these are just better drivers than Lando Norris. That is a fact at the moment. The championship standings, I think, from last year and this year reflect that very opinion. And that is what exposes Lando's deficiencies in things like his race starts, his ability under pressure, and also the fact that he just is not as good as the other two in wheel-to-wheel combat. All of this, I think, has bitten him a lot after the things that he has said earlier in his career, and so he just needs to find a better headspace right now. And again, whether that is just going to new people like an ex-Formula 1 driver that can just help relieve some of that pressure when he's really feeling it, or whether it's things that he needs to do with the car within the team, these are the things that he needs to look at the moment, because he has got a golden opportunity still to be a champion at the end of the season, but he is nowhere near being a driver even capable or even deserving of winning the world title right now. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.